JFK 35 is a production of the JFK Library Foundation. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the guest's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of others at the JFK Library Foundation or the JFK Library, including staff, board, or donors. The material and information presented here is for general historical and educational information purposes only. The views expressed in the podcast are not meant to imply any endorsement of or opposition to any organization or political party.
We wouldn't be the same country if we didn't have these freedoms. And there are just examples throughout our history of, the freedom of the press, the freedom of assembly, really changing conditions for Americans for the better.
When the framers ratified the U.S. Constitution, they soon added 10 amendments to the document, now known as the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment protected 5 fundamental freedoms: religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition.
This week, award-winning journalist Tamara Keith joins us to explore how those 5 freedoms have shaped our country and helped make it what it is today, 250 years later. We'll also look back at how President Kennedy and other more recent presidents have viewed the freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment. That conversation is next on JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Matt Porter.
And I'm Jamie Richardson. Welcome to our special America 250 season of JFK 35. As the United States marks its 250th anniversary, we'll explore the ideas, values, and debates that have shaped our nation from its founding to the present day. This week, we're looking at the First Amendment and the 5 freedoms it guarantees Americans.
The rights protected by the First Amendment are a bedrock of American democracy and remain among the values the United States is best known for around the world. Joining us today is NPR senior political correspondent and co-host of the NPR Politics podcast, Tamara Keith. Tamara, thanks for joining us.
Very excited to be with you.
Great to have you here.
Thank you so much. We're so happy to talk to you today about the First Amendment and how modern presidents have approached that part of our Constitution. When people talk about the First Amendment, they often refer to the 5 freedoms: freedom of religion, of speech, of the press, of assembly, and of petition. So let's start with the part you're most familiar with, and that's the press. But before we begin, we'll hear from President Kennedy on his interpretation of that freedom.
Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive. And that is why our press was protected by the First Amendment, the only business in America specifically protected by the Constitution, not primarily to amuse and entertain, not to emphasize the trivial and the sentimental, not to simply give the public what it wants, but to inform, to arouse, to reflect, to state our dangers and our opportunities, to indicate our crises and our choices, to lead, mold, educate, and sometimes even anger public opinion.
Big words from President Kennedy there. What do you take away from listening to the president there, Tamara, particularly that the press is the only business in America specifically protected by the Constitution?
Well, it's true. So let's go with that. First off, the freedom of the press is explicitly written into the Constitution. And I think that President Kennedy gets at some of the reasons why that is important. Sure, there is fun, there is amusement, but really the freedom of the press is about making our government better, about holding government accountable, about educating, as he says. And so I think that, I think that the freedom of the press, this business, and we can talk about how well the business is doing right now, but that it is a critical part of a functioning democracy.
And how important, from your experience, do you feel freedom of the press has been for the success of the United States as a country?
So, funny thing, I know that you want me to talk about modern presidents, but I have come here armed with some Thomas Jefferson. Because I think that he has some really great quotes on this, and I think that in some ways what President Kennedy is talking about is echoing the very idea that our founding father, one of our founding fathers, discussed. He wrote in 1786. He wrote, "Our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, and that cannot be limited without being lost." And then there's this other quote from him where he says, I think this is the famous one, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." And I mean, I'm obviously biased, but I think that this is a great sentiment. And I think that it does, I think that in no small measure, our freedom as Americans depends on the transparency and the clarity that comes from a free and independent press, providing scrutiny and sunlight and amplifying what is happening so that the public can make informed decisions about what they want.
And where have you seen presidents draw their lines when it comes to press freedom? Obviously, I think Thomas Jefferson probably pretty different from others.
Well, and shall we just say that rhetoric is not the same thing as action? And I think that many presidents who have said all the right words about the importance of a free press have still, through some of their actions at least, undermined that freedom. I think that one place where presidents draw their lines on the freedom of the press is a little word called leaks. And how a leak is defined and whether that is a national security threat, that is an area where we have seen presidents, including presidents, I think of President Obama, who certainly said a lot of the right words about the freedom of the press, but also his administration conducted leak investigations and, tried to get journalists to reveal their sources. And we have seen that certainly in the Trump administration. There are ongoing cases where the Justice Department sought to get journalists' notes or actually seized their electronics that they were using for their reporting and under the cover of a leak investigation. But there's just such a fine line between national security and intimidating or impeding the freedom of the press.
And I think you mentioned this a little bit when you talked about the business of the press, but as a reporter, as where the business changes, the medium changes, and the presidents change, how do you feel the current state of the free press is in the United States?
It's the best of times and it's the worst of times. Journalists are doing incredible, amazing work, and our journalism, broadly speaking, for the press in the broadest way possible, our journalism in America right now is very strong. Our industry is in a really bad way. You have news deserts all over the country. You have local small newspapers failing. You have them getting bought up by big conglomerates that then are just sort of turning them into zombies that aren't really producing any local news. You have all kinds of issues that the press corps is having right now, the White House press corps is having right now with limitations on access and changes to who, you essentially now have the president choosing his press corps rather than the other way around, rather than the press corps choosing who would be in the room for any given event. So there are all kinds of challenges. Let's talk about consolidation at the television level, network television consolidation, all of the challenges that are happening at CBS and 60 Minutes, and not to mention FCC investigations, lawsuits by the president against news organizations for reporting things that he doesn't like. Not that they're not true, but he objects to the reporting, and so he's filing lawsuits to try to stop it or to intimidate them or to extract payments. I mean, this really is, in so many ways, the worst of times. Our business model is threatened by AI and any number of other things, by social media and shortening attention spans, and people not even realizing that they're being, sort of that they're being funneled into an algorithm that is feeding them only certain information. There's just so many incredible challenges, and yet the journalism that's being produced, the stories that are being reported, are incredible. I'm proud to be part of the greater American press corps right now.
So it sounds like a lot of challenges and fragility, but also an opportunity.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of journalism to commit right now. There's a lot to cover, and there's no shortage of things to expose. And also, I think that we're in this moment in the country where people have a hard time seeing their fellow Americans as like people and not just avatars of rage or the other side. And I think journalism at its best also helps people see each other.
Yes. And one thing before we move on to the other four freedoms, but I wanted to talk about, President Kennedy in that quote that we started with talked about the press being important to inform. How is that role more difficult by the spread of disinformation? We used to always say a lie travels around, the world 1,000 times before the truth can put its pants on. But it really feels like in a different way now, you're dealing with disinformation, not just from bad actors, but maybe even from official sources that maybe prior to the last presidencies you could trust more. And now it seems like even official sources are, you have to fact check them in ways that maybe you haven't done before. And how does that make it difficult?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for the news consumer, it's incredibly difficult to differentiate between fact and fiction. And AI makes that even harder. And obviously, disinformation and misinformation is everywhere. And, some random person making a video on TikTok that is somehow derivative of the journalism that someone has actually done, nobody's going to go back to them and say, you got something wrong. Like, there's no accountability there. But for those of us who are working for serious news organizations, there's a lot of accountability and there are corrections and all of those things. But it's just, we're up against these market forces at the same time. So I think that all of that disinformation and misinformation makes fact-based reporting all the more important, but it also makes it hard to be heard.
Thanks for that really interesting kind of dive into where we are today. And we just want to move on to the next freedom, which President Kennedy had a lot to say about, which is freedom of religion. Part of it was that he was a Catholic candidate for president, and so many were worried that his religion would take precedence over his duties to the Constitution. Here's what he said on the campaign trail in 1960 to a group of ministers in Houston.
I would not look with favor upon a president working to subvert the First Amendment's guarantees of religious liberty, nor would our system of checks and balances permit him to do so. And neither do I look with favor upon those who would work to subvert Article 6 of the Constitution by requiring a religious test, even by indirection. For if they disagree with that safeguard, they should be openly working to repeal it.
So hearing him on the campaign trail, what jumps out at you from his views on the role and place of religion compared to today's political culture around religion?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is fascinating to hear him because he does come. His discussion of religion comes from almost a place of defensiveness, it reads, because he was having to prove that he would be loyal to the United States and the United States Constitution and not, to the Pope or something. And, I think that there have been ebbs and flows of how important religion is in the election of a president. And there have been other moments. I think that one thing that, and perhaps it's because I have recently covered the opening of the Obama Presidential Center in Chicago, but President Obama also had to give a big speech. It was a big speech about race, but that was the thing about him that was different. And President Kennedy, the thing about him that was different is that he was Catholic. The fascinating thing about Obama is that he gave this big speech about race, but it was because of controversial things that had been said by a pastor, a religious figure who had been part of his life. So I just think that the parallels there are very interesting. I would say that in this year, in this time in the Trump presidency, you have a very interesting contrast because you have a president who almost never goes to church. The White House press pool goes wherever the president goes. So we know when the president goes to church. And President Trump very rarely goes to church, like basically Christmas Eve. And yet, discussion of religion, in particular, an emphasis on evangelical Christian religious views, has never been more present in government than it is right now. In my time in covering government, I should say. So I only go back to, the 2010s in covering religion and government. But there was this big event on the National Mall, all built around prayer. There have been all of these events that with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, his funeral was as much a religious revival as a traditional memorial service, and the president was very much in the mix there. So this is a very evangelical Christianity forward moment, and I think that there's a very big range. Like President Biden actually went to church almost every weekend. And he was also Catholic, but he didn't, other than crossing himself sometimes when he was making a joke, he didn't talk about religion all that much.
It's really interesting to see, again, those three different presidents and how they approached religion during their presidencies. And I guess the last question I have on this particular section is, the First Amendment, we always talk about as these were the first priorities of the framers. And why do you think this what we became known as the separation of church and state, as we think about it, has been so critical to having this be part of the United States philosophy over its history?
Well, I mean, in the beginning, it was because religion was being imposed upon the people. And part of our founding was a rejection of that and so many other things. And as I said before, there's sort of been these ebbs and flows of how much separation is there really between church and state? And I think right now there is less separation than there has been in other times. And part of that is that we've seen some rulings from the Supreme Court that have narrowed some of that division. And then certainly we've also seen just the current administration put religion forward. We're also seeing this in the Defense Department, for instance.
Let's look at petition and assembly together, since they're a bit connected. Both are freedoms for citizens to try and redress grievances or fix societal wrongs. So again, let's start with President Kennedy. And here's what he had to say about, at the time, civil rights protests happening across the South, and then the March on Washington, which we're all familiar with. So here's what President Kennedy had to say.
The federal government does not control these demonstrations. It neither starts them, directs them, or stops them. What we can do is seek, through legislation and executive action, to provide peaceful remedies for the grievances which set them off, to give all Americans, in short, a fair chance for an equal life.
No, I think that the way that the Washington March is now developed, which is a peaceful assembly calling for a redress of grievances, the cooperation with the police, every evidence that it's going to be peaceful. They're going to the Washington Monument. They're going to express their strong views. I think that's in the great tradition.
So we're just hearing President Kennedy talk about these basically marches against the government, and he kind of compliments them in a way, like saying these are great parts of our society. How do you see the role of, as he said, peaceful assemblies and the right to petition one's government in preserving American democracy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are incredible moments in history where people have risen up and made it clear that whatever it is that the government is doing is not working for them. And they have applied pressure, ideally through peaceful means. And as a result, women have a right to vote. As a result, we had the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act and all of these changes that were made to move towards a more equal society and to arguably get the country closer to something that the framers imagined, even if they didn't imagine it exactly in that way. So, yeah, I mean, I think that assembly and petition are a big part of how the American people have a voice when they feel voiceless, when voting isn't enough, or when the voting is, tilted in such a way that they don't get real representation or enough representation. They can show that the people need a voice by with numbers, with just sheer numbers. And so I think it's also one of the more challenging parts of the First Amendment, because it has proven very challenging to many a government, and has led to violent clashes where police have cracked down on protesters. We obviously saw earlier this year with the federal agents ultimately killing a couple of American citizens who were protesting against immigration enforcement in Minneapolis. So assembly and peaceful assembly is this powerful force in America, but it also has led to conflict and has led to just real difficulty in governments and police figuring out how to allow those freedoms while also maintaining order.
And as your career and time as a reporter, have you covered any protests? And if so, what has it been like to see people take to the streets and kind of fulfill firsthand these rights and responsibilities they have with the Constitution?
Yeah, and I have not been a general assignment reporter in a really long time. So the protests that I covered most extensively were like anti-Iraq war protests in the early 2000s, protests of some death penalty cases in California when I was a very young reporter. But certainly we have seen many protests in recent years, from the Women's March to the No Kings protests. Obviously, also January 6th was theoretically a protest that turned into something much more severe.
And speaking of January 6th, there is always, President Kennedy did it. I'm sure lots of presidents have done this, emphasizing peaceful assemblies in the First Amendment. So when we think about January 6th, how do you think that notion of the importance of peaceful assemblies compared to what happened that day and kind of the impact and legacy?
It wasn't peaceful. I mean, I think that's the most important thing to say. It was, certainly there were people there who had peaceful intentions and who remained peaceful. There were also people who came with things that could be used as weapons, who came with bear spray that they aimed at police. There was incredible violence on that day, just intense violence and destruction of property, and police officers were severely injured. So I think one of the challenging things with January 6th is that there has been an attempt to rewrite that history. I mean, it was almost immediate. It was like, oh, this was just a tourist visit. One Republican congressman said. It was not a tourist visit. It was a riot. It was an insurrection. It was an attempt to stop a peaceful transfer of power, and it was not peaceful. And very clearly, our politics have not fully reckoned with this. It continues to be a real gash in the American body politic. And I think that, President Trump has a desire to rewrite that history in a different way. And, up on Capitol Hill, there is still just a very significant rift between the members of Congress who want to dismiss what happened and those who are still traumatized by what happened.
Yeah, I think it just reminds us, because we don't have that happen too often in our history, but it reminds to me why they wrote peaceful assembly, because a peaceful assembly is a push to get some sort of political solution, whereas a non-peaceful assembly has a much more disturbing and more an insurrection type situation can happen.
Yeah, and an assembly at its best shows just the sheer numbers behind something. Like, it on one level, it allows those who agree with the protesters or are among the protesters to realize that they aren't alone. And on January 6th, there were people who felt like they were not alone. But then it took a very, very violent turn.
The freedom of speech is often one of the most misunderstood freedoms because people often assume it means total freedom to say what you want without any consequences, personal or professional. But really, the First Amendment's freedom is about protection from government on limiting your speech. In 1959, Senator John F. Kennedy discussed the freedom of speech himself at a national conference on civil liberties when he said, "I am not so much concerned with the right of everyone to say anything he pleases as I am about our need as a self-governing people to hear everything relevant." What has been your thoughts on how presidents past and present have interpreted the First Amendment?
Well, I think that freedom of speech gets complicated when you combine it with private companies. And I think that that's where recent presidents, I will just talk about the two most recent presidents, have caused uproar, and I think in different ways. The Biden administration during the COVID pandemic did try to get social media companies to take down misinformation or disinformation related to COVID, or to sort of toggle the algorithm on them. And they were essentially asking a private company to constrain speech, which is the private company's right to do. It's a private company. It's a private platform. The question is whether those companies felt like they had a choice, and whether they were pressured to do so. In the Trump administration, there has been speech that the president didn't like. I'm thinking of, for instance, Jimmy Kimmel, the late night comedian, and the full force of the government has been brought to bear on these private companies. Now there's something of a fig leaf that says, oh no, this investigation is completely unrelated to the speech that the president very clearly said he didn't like. But now ABC and Disney are having to deal with investigations from the Federal Communications Commission. It is not hard to draw a line between speech the president didn't like and this then happening. So, I guess what I would go back to, sort of big picture, is that there is always going to be speech that presidents don't like. Because one of the great joys of the American way is that you can criticize your government. And you can even criticize your neighbor. And in some ways, the government, the president just has to take it. You ran for president. You are, the most powerful person in the land. And so, of course, people are going to criticize you.
My favorite thing I learned in con law for journalism was that presidents have very little resource to sue for libel and slander because they have such a position to respond to those criticisms.
Well, you should tell that to some people.
Maybe. But I think Jamie has a couple more questions here.
Just a couple more.
Sorry.
That's okay. You kind of gave some examples of this, but both parties are both sides on the political spectrum. These past few administrations have been criticizing the other for restricting or putting a chill on certain types of speech. You gave the example with Biden and both with Trump. Given that, how do you view the state of free speech in the U.S. today?
Yeah, I want to give a free speech / free press example, which is that the Associated Press made an editorial decision not to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. Made an editorial decision to continue to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of Mexico instead of changing the name, as President Trump wanted, to the Gulf of America. They would mention that it was that Trump called it the Gulf of America, but because they have an international audience, they were largely sticking with Gulf of Mexico. And the president and the White House then punished that news organization for that editorial decision and kicked them off of Air Force One, kicked them out of the pool, limited their access to cover the president, simply because of speech that they didn't like, that the administration didn't like. So how do I view the state of free speech in America today? I think it's never been perfect. There have always been heated debates about, well, should this speech be free? I get that we have free speech, but what about this speech? And, like lots of speech makes lots of people uncomfortable. And we have certainly seen cases where speech is then constrained. I think that on the press side of it, there is certainly an intimidation factor or an effort in intimidation through lawsuits and other things to make journalism organizations think twice about what they report and how they report it. I don't know that it's working. Actually, I don't think it is working in most cases. I think that journalists continue to report mostly fearlessly. And I think that that is something that makes us unique. I was in China covering President Trump's trip to Beijing in the spring. And there was this Chinese journalist videotaping me while I was just like waiting to cover the president. And she said, "Wow, there are so many people there." And wow, there are so many journalists that came to cover the president. Why is that? And I said, we have freedom of the press and we take that seriously. And where I was standing at the moment that I said that was outside of the Great Hall of the People, across the street from Tiananmen Square, where a pro-democracy protest was violently put down by the Chinese government in 1989. And that's the kind of thing that we can do. Like that is guaranteed in our Constitution that we can, as Americans, as a journalist, I don't really get to do the protest thing because that's not my job. I'm not allowed to protest. I'm not allowed to have strong opinions. But as Americans, we have the right to go stand there and say, we don't like what our government is doing.
And actually, this last question definitely ties into the anecdote you just told about being in China. So not every country, as you mentioned, has such a robust First Amendment like ours in protecting the 5 freedoms, in particular press in this example. And now as we're celebrating 250 years, why do you think this First Amendment has been such an important part of our nation's success or something to celebrate?
Well, I mean, I guess it all comes back down to freedom, right? Like freedom is such an incredibly important value in sort of the American way. And being able to say what you want to say, go where you want to go, pray how you want to pray, all of that is essential to America. That is part of what makes us what we are. We wouldn't be the same country if we didn't have these freedoms. And there are just examples throughout our history of that, the freedom of the press, the freedom of assembly, really changing conditions for Americans for the better.
Tamara, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have someone who is a practitioner of the First Amendment to be with us today to talk about it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our latest episode in our special America 250 Summer Series. If you're interested in learning more about some of the items we discussed today, you can visit our podcast page for this episode. It includes links to all of the items we mentioned today.
If you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or tag us at JFK Library FDN using the hashtag JFK35. If you liked what you heard today, please consider subscribing to our podcast or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening and have a great week.